A reading from the book of Exodus. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall mark for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Tell the whole congregation of Israel that on the 10th of this month they are to take a lamb for each family, a lamb for each household. If a household is too small for a whole lamb, it shall join its closest neighbor in obtaining one. The lamb shall be divided in proportion to the number of people who eat it. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a year-old male. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep it until the 14th day of this month. Then the whole assembled congregation of Israel shall slaughter it at twilight. They shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the lamb the same night, and they shall eat it roasted over fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted over the fire, with its heads, legs, and inner organs. You shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains in the morning you shall burn. This is how you shall eat it: your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it hurriedly. It is the Passover of the Lord. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both human beings and animals. On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live. When I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague shall destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This day shall be a day of remembrance from you. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord throughout your generations, and you shall observe it as a perpetual ordinance." Here ends the readings. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you all. If the story of the Exodus is the core story of the people of Israel, then the story of the institution of the Passover is maybe one of those key moments within this story. It is maybe somewhat analogous to the Christian equivalent of the Lord's Supper. Both meals have the promise of liberation and redemption. Both meals extend covenant with God. Both meals are celebrated within the overshadowing and impending nature of death around them. And we have to ask the question, why is this story of the Passover put here? In context, the story of the Passover is kind of an interlude between the plagues, between the 9 that have gone before and the final plague. 9 times Moses has gone before Pharaoh and issued God's demand to let God's people go. 9 times Pharaoh has refused. 9 times God has visited a plague on Egypt, on the Egyptians and the people of Israel alike. And as we read that unfolding of the surface of the story, perhaps you, like me, have a little bit of difficulty reconciling this God of anger and retribution that seems to be in this story with the God of love and compassion that we speak about within Christianity. And even if you look at the texts that are being produced at about the same time that this story is being edited in its final form in the Babylonian exile, it's hard to square it with the theology of those other texts. Texts like 2nd Isaiah, which is Isaiah chapter 40 on forward, that speak of the liberation and the homecoming of Israel from exile, but do not speak of the destruction of the Babylonians. Rather, God's mighty hand reaching out and plucking Israel up and bringing them home becomes an occasion of wonder, where the nations may see the might and the power and the wisdom of God and come to follow God's ways. Perhaps we need to take a step back and see what is going on in the wider sense of the story. And indeed, As we look through Genesis, we will acknowledge that we run into all sorts of nefarious figures. We run into murderers, rapists, thieves, and more. But no one quite seems to rise to the level of evil of Pharaoh. And we must hold Genesis and the beginning of the story of Exodus in juxtaposition. One of the early assertions that happens in the story of the Exodus is the statement that the people of Egypt forgot who Joseph was. And in forgetting who Joseph was and what Joseph did, they forgot what God did for Egypt through Joseph. And in that forgetting, they gave themselves the permission to oppress and enslave the people of Israel. Pharaoh even coming to the point of engaging in a genocidal program to get rid of all newborn Israelite boys. One of the early lessons of Exodus is to forget is to invite death. But actually the story goes further. If you look at the figure of Pharaoh over and against the figure of God, Pharaoh sets himself up as God in opposition to God. And where we read in the creation story that God says to humanity, "Go forth, increase, and multiply," we hear in the Exodus story that Pharaoh says to his forces, "Go forth, seek out the Israelite boys, kill." It is a perfect diametric opposition to God. And as the conflict unfolds between God's demands and Pharaoh's interests, every time Pharaoh says no to God, every time the Egyptians are led deeper into the vision of Pharaoh for Egypt, creation in Egypt begins to unravel. That's what the plagues are about. It is a response of creation to rejection of God. And the lesson is that as we live into this kind of evil, all of us suffer, Egyptian and Israelite alike. And the story of the Passover comes at the point where the final plague is about to happen, where creation will do its final unraveling and death will be the result. And the story of the Passover is sort of an interlude, an interjection that provides a different trajectory for the people of Israel, so that they do not have to continue and experience the cycle of violence and the death of Pharaoh, that they have a way out, that cycle of violence and that threat of death is abrogated for them as they follow a different path. And so this meal of Passover is billed as a meal of remembrance. And to remember in Hebrew isn't the same thing as to remember in English. When we say remember in English, it's almost like a fond reminiscence of times past. This is a powerful word in Hebrew. To remember in Hebrew is to call to mind a relationship with a person, either in the past or in the present, and not just bring that person to mind, but to bring to mind the obligations that are inherent in that relationship. And so when Moses tells the people of Israel that this Passover meal is to be a meal of remembrance, and it comes on the cusp of their liberation, what Moses is saying to them is, remember that God is a God of righteousness, that God is a God of justice, that God is a God of liberation, that God is a God of peace. And if you partake in this meal and go on this new path that God is laying before you, then you must live yourselves with righteousness, with justice, with liberation, with peace. The inherent lesson that comes out of this is the opposite of that as forgetfulness, where forgetfulness brings about the conditions that bring death. To remember brings life. And this is a lesson we must learn over and over and over again in the church. Over the past several decades, as society has rapidly changed around us, and the church has tried to adapt to that change, we have had to make decisions about what we will retain about church, what is going to be new. And sometimes we have thrown out things and we have engaged in memory loss and created a church of amnesia where we have forgotten who we are and who we are called to be. I sometimes wonder if the reason I went to study theology more deeply and to become a church historian wasn't because that I implicitly knew that to remember was to embrace life, that someone in the church had to remember the traditions, someone in the church had to remember the theology, someone in the church had to remember the spirituality, that it would have a chance to ignite and be carried forward in the church again. And in our own times, when we have seen the changes that have already been working around us accelerate in fantastic ways due to the pandemic of COVID-19, I think that lesson is one that we must take dearly to heart. To forget invites death. To remember invites life. And if that was all that this text had to offer us, that would be sufficient. But I think there's more. Perhaps it is because we have been living through a summer of great upheaval around the question of race that I have come to this story and read it again with new eyes. And this time, yes, the situation is created where oppression and slavery happened and death happened because the people of Egypt forgot who God was, forgot the benefits that Joseph brought them by means of God. We see that the trigger for all of this is racism. That the Egyptians considered themselves the superior race. That the Egyptians considered they had a right to rule. That the Egyptians considered the Israelites an inferior race, an immigrant nation from somewhere else, whose multiplication, whose increase in their numbers, threatened not only their sense of who they are and their purity as Egyptians, but also threatened their sense of security. And so their response was to meet oppression and death on them. I read that story in the context of what we are experiencing now, and I take great pause. And as the story unfolds, and we realize that the attitudes and the practices of racism in Egypt caused creation to unravel around them, and that those unravelings of creation were experienced not only by the Egyptians but also by the Israelites, everyone. So this notion that we who consider ourselves not racist, we who consider ourselves away from those conversations, we who live in a place where race isn't an issue, that we, because of that, are unaffected. I think the story tells us that that notion is false. That racism is pervasive, that affects us all, that it deforms us all, whether we are near to it or far from it. And that we need to engage in a process of remembering. There are many who would say that racism is a political issue, and that it can be solved within the political realm. As I this summer have read through the sermons of Martin Luther King Jr., I have seen that he disagreed with that profoundly. He saw that racism was not just a political reality, but a spiritual disease, a spiritual sickness that could only be cured by a spiritual discipline. And I think he's right. Racism will never go away by the laws that we pass. Racism will go away when we remember who we are, when we remember what God has done for us, when we remember that God is a God of righteousness, justice, liberation, and peace, and that as God's people, in remembering that, we have an obligation to live out our lives in righteousness, extending justice, providing liberation, and extending peace. That this is the beginning of a new path for God's people to become the blessed community that God dreams we can be. The question is how to do that. Where do we even begin? Well, that's what the rest of the story of Exodus is all about. How God's people come from this point where they step away from the cycle of death and destruction, and in remembering who God is, and in embracing God's path, begin to live differently, begin to live transformed lives. And so let us take note of this moment in our own history as we put it up against the history of God's ancient people, and look with expectation and eagerness for the lessons that this story has to give us, that we might become transformed, and that we might walk with God's path with open arms, and embracing those who would also walk God's path of righteousness, justice, liberation, and peace. May God bless us in these difficult times. Amen.